これより特別講演を開始いたします。講演者は、オックスフォード大学教授、マーク・ハリソン先生です。マーク・ハリソン先生は、オックスフォード大学歴史学部教授でいらっしゃいます。かつてのイギリス植民地、特にインドにおける医療史分野の第一人者であり、現在はイギリス政府のシニアアドバイザーとして、イギリスにおけるパンデミック安全と警戒体制について尽力されています。本日は COVID-19 への歴史からの教訓と題しましてご講演いただきます。座長を務めますのは、九州大学比較社会文化研究院教授兼セキュリティ防災クラスター長鬼丸武先生です。それではハリソン先生、鬼丸先生、よろしくお願いいたします。
So good afternoon. So thank you for staying with us. This is the last session of today's long afternoon. The last and the special speaker is Prof. Mark Harrison, Oxford University. Today, Professor Harrison kindly joined this event from Oxford. There is 8 hours time difference between Fukuoka and Oxford. So here is already 4:36 in the afternoon, but in the Oxford, I guess around 8:30 in the morning. So thank you again. We would like to say that thank you, Professor Harrison, even though from the early morning to join us and to share his view on current pandemic of COVID-19. So his presentation title is Pandemic and Protest, the COVID-19 from a historical perspective. So Professor Harrison, please.
Thank you very much. I'll just share my screen first of all. Okay, so this afternoon I'd just like to share my thoughts as a historian and also somebody that's been actively involved in advising the UK government on some aspects of the pandemic since it began, or at least since beginning of March this year. And my work for the government and also a lot of my historical work has really revolved around some of the kind of security aspects, but I think my government work also has gone particularly into some of the policing aspects. And I suppose the insights that I've gained from that, I've tried to incorporate to some extent into this lecture along with the historical ones. So really what I'm going to do in this lecture is to give you, first of all, a historical overview of epidemics and pandemics and some of the security aspects of that, particularly focusing on disorder and protest. So I think that's something that's been very evident during this pandemic. So I want to provide in the first part of the lecture a historical perspective on that to try to give you an outline of what I think are some of the main themes. And then to look more specifically at the current pandemic to see how we can use history to try to understand where we are at the moment in the pandemic and also possibly what some of the likely implications of the pandemic are. So I think in this case, the pandemic is quite different from other ones, and we need to think of it as well as being in some ways something we can understand by using history. We also need to understand those aspects of it which are actually novel. So to begin with, I just really take you through in a very basic way some of what I think are some of the most salient points from the historiography of epidemics and pandemics. Well, the first thing to recognize is that historical work on epidemics has really been with us for some time. It's been really since the 1960s that historians began to look at epidemics, specifically as tests of social cohesion, as ways of understanding the extent to which a country is able to withstand the test of what was usually perceived as a kind of an external stressor. And one of the first historians to do that, you can see pictured here, is a British historian, Asa Briggs, later Lord Briggs, who in some ways can be seen as a kind of pioneer of this type of history, which of course has become, very, very popular over the years. And in the 1970s, there was a whole slew of books written on various aspects of pandemics and epidemics. And obviously many people are still writing on that today. But really underlying most of this scholarship is the idea that epidemics tend to increase tensions which already exist in the society, but which are not usually that evident. In other words, they kind of unleash latent tensions. And sometimes, of course, they erupt violently in rioting and maybe attacks on officials. And we've seen a fair amount of that already in this pandemic. In modern times, it's important to remember that these episodes of disorder, at least as it's perceived by the state, or as protest often, as it's perceived by the people undertaking it, are actually caused by the intervention of the state rather than the epidemic itself. But the two things actually often come together. So sometimes fear of the epidemic creates a kind of state of anxiety in society, which is then exacerbated by government action. So there's an interplay between the type of disease and what the government actually does. And that then connects with the kind of the pre-existing state of society. And those variables are really the things that determine, how stable a society is, whether or not there are actually extreme examples of disorder that occur during an epidemic. So here is a sort of fairly schematic view of what I think are some of the main factors. So if we take the disease itself, one of the things that determines its social impact and its propensity to give rise to disorder are its, if you like, biological attributes. And the most obvious of those is case fatality. So if a disease is very fatal, like plague, for instance, it tends to arouse a lot more fear. That's kind of self-evident. Also, if it's perceived as being very contagious, if there's something maybe particular about its mode of spread, that's also creates fear, then that's clearly significant. But other things are also important, like, if you like, demographics. Sometimes epidemics, including the one that we're actually experiencing at the moment, affect certain groups within society more than others, either because they tend to be more exposed to infection, or because maybe if they become infected, they are actually at more risk of dying from the infection. And then obviously things like symptoms are also important. So if a disease actually has quite horrific symptoms, for instance, like cholera, where somebody could be just walking down the street and then feels ill and then suddenly experiences severe diarrhea and so on. Those symptoms, let alone the actual fear of fatality, actually can give rise to a great deal of panic and disorder. But the after effects of disease are also important, like scarring, disability, and something like smallpox is a really good example of that, because it's both highly fatal, and if you manage to survive, then you're likely to be left scarred or perhaps blind from actually having the disease. And the last factor, which is particularly pertinent to the present epidemic, is novelty. If a disease is new, it's apt to create a lot more fear and confusion. So then if we just move to the kind of the social aspects of an epidemic, well, social inequality tends to increase exposure to disease. And so in many countries around the world today, for instance, you've seen that people, particularly lower class people, sometimes in particular ethnic groups, are more exposed. And that's often been the case throughout history. As I mentioned just now, the government response is another key variable. but pre-existing levels of trust in government and also in the agencies of government, like police, the medical authorities, public health staff, and so on, those are also crucially important when it comes to the perceived legitimacy of the government's response in tackling the disease. So if there's existing level of distrust, for instance, in the police, and the police are important in enforcing quarantine and that kind of thing, then that's likely to lead to a certain amount of disorder, at least in certain communities, maybe not throughout the whole of society. And lastly, it's civil society itself responds independently of the government. So, mutual aid societies, churches, other religious establishments, all these, the existence of these and how they behave is also quite an important factor. So that's an overview. Obviously, pandemics and epidemics are in some ways similar, but the ways in which the various the variables that I've just mentioned interact in a pandemic is slightly different from an epidemic occurring within one country or maybe a number of countries in a particular region. In pandemics especially, you tend to see a lot of rivalry between states. If you like, a sort of a certain amount of competitive emulation in some cases, but also in other cases, a rejection of the models that are used by other states. And this is sometimes not simply done on the grounds of science or the advice of medical officers, but it is really about a state's political tradition or about wanting to make a point about being different from another state. In other words, maybe showing that your state is kind of stronger or on the other hand, showing that it's maybe not going to act like another state, which is perceived to be very authoritarian. That's give you some sort of idea of what I mean. And I think, and you've seen this quite a lot actually in the current pandemic, the expectations of the population in democratic countries are also very important. So governments can sometimes be forced to do things they don't want to. And the expectations of the population are often shaped by what is going on in other countries. And that was certainly the case in the UK in the current pandemic. And so really since the notion of the pandemic has come into being at the end of the 19th century, during the third plague pandemic, so-called, in the beginning in the 1890s, which you can see a picture of here. This is some British soldiers destroying an area in Hong Kong, which is infected by plague. When people started to begin to see pictures like that in the newspaper and to read about it, they began to have a sense of what was going on in the other parts of the world, and they began to see, to see pandemics as we do today, and to fear the infection of disease because of that, but also to try and learn from what was happening in other parts of the world. So moving on now to specifically to types of disorder or protest. There's a few general points to be made here. First of all, there's quite a lot of, if you like, or conceptual or selection bias in historical writing and also in non-historical writing about epidemics and pandemics. There's a tendency to emphasize disorder. And, for a historian, it's always very attractive to write about disorder because it's, people inherently find that interesting. But actually, in the vast majority of cases, epidemics don't elicit any kind of major social disorder. And Samuel Cohn's book, which I'm putting on the slide here, is making that point very strongly. But of course, in some cases, they do. And where that does happen, disorder can actually be a form of protest. And I think this is particularly true of modern societies. There are really two types of disorder. One is not related to state intervention, and the other is very directly related to it. The types of disorder that I'm talking about here would include riots or affray, that is kind of public disorder, collective disorder, which is short of a full-scale riot. more targeted violence against the agents of the state, be they police officers, doctors, and so on. Various types of communal violence, which includes scapegoating of certain sections of the population. And things like mass industrial action. And there are many more, some of which I'll mention in this lecture. We just say something briefly about non-state related disorder, although that's not my main concern. In pre-modern times, generally speaking, that occurred within a community. And the reason for it was essentially to kind of restore equilibrium. And you know, the sociologist Emil Durkheim used the phrase the common conscience, and a lot of the violence you see or disorder that you see in epidemics in pre-modern societies is usually in some senses a kind of an expression of the common conscience, where usually quite marginal peoples or people who are seen to kind of disrupt the equilibrium of society are very often driven out, or in some cases persecuted and killed. And the most obvious example of that, which you can see on the slide here, is the pogroms against Jews in medieval Europe during the Black Death. But there are other examples where people perceived as witches and so on are also killed or driven out. And in this case, there are elements within the society who, to use Durkheim's phrase, become heroes and executioners, kind of acting on behalf of the common conscience. And in modern societies, we can also see non-state related disorder in the form of ethnic, religious, maybe homophobic violence, class antagonisms, which are not related to the government, or maybe only indirectly. So if you want to kind of sum up, in a sense, kind of modern non-state related disorder is essentially kind of structural in nature. It's related to social structures. In pre-modern times, it wasn't. It's really about restoring equilibrium. Now, if we move on to protest against the state, which is really the main focus of my talk, the most common causes are perceived discrimination, disproportionality or inconsistency of government interventions, inequality of impact. That means even although measures apply to everyone, some people are more disadvantaged by them than others. For instance, a measure like quarantine or a lockdown maybe affects disproportionately people on low incomes, and that's something which has happened in many societies around the world during the present pandemic. Heavy intervention by state actors like doctors or often police is another important factor, and another cause of protest, and also religious or cultural insensitivity on the part of government or the agents of government in implementing anti-epidemic policies. Those are generally speaking, the most common causes. So just take each of these in turn now. The most common form of discrimination in anti-epidemic measures is targeting, or the perceived targeting, of people in lower social groups. So throughout history, it tends to be the kind of lower social groups who are the target of most of the measures used to control epidemics, and that goes right back to Renaissance Europe during the Black Death. And that kind of remains the case. But particularly over the last few centuries, there's often separately, but sometimes usually sometimes kind of intertwined with measures targeted against lower social groups. There's also a degree of ethnic selection or perceived bias, or maybe bias towards a particular religious group. And also, in the case of some diseases in particular, obviously, most obviously sexually transmitted diseases, there can also manifest in a perception of bias or actual bias towards certain groups, and most obviously homophobia. But there is also occasionally perceived discrimination against people in certain occupations or people of certain ages. And the illustration you can see here illustrates a couple of those together. What you have is some lower class Muslims in the city of Karachi, now in Pakistan, at this point in British India, about 1900, which are being publicly disinfected to remove them of the possibility of, to remove a possible plague infection. And you can imagine that this would not have been done to people of a higher social status, maybe even if they were Muslims. So this is a kind of clear example of discrimination. Now, another one is, as I say, disproportionality and inconsistency of policy. That tends to create a lot of disorder. So in addition to seeming possibly also discriminatory, it can suggest loss of grip or incompetence on the part of government. And this kind of perception is particularly common in the case of new diseases, where there's a lot of confusion among people in government about what to do. And also maybe in certain countries about the suspicion, there may be suspicion about why government is actually acting in a certain way, particularly if there's a long-standing distrust of the government. And you see that very clearly in the 1830s, and this is the picture here is of the Russian Tsar coming into a square in Moscow with the crowd having been subdued. The crowd was formerly rioting against the quarantines and other measures which were put in place. And this was largely because government did not have confidence, the people did not have confidence in how the rulers of the country were dealing with this new disease, cholera, that they'd first experienced in 1830 in Moscow. And because there was long-standing suspicion of the government, they tended to think that these measures which were being taken simply to disadvantage the lower classes, or in some cases to kill them. And today, in the case of COVID-19, you also find many people who fail to understand, who don't really see, why government is acting in a certain way. Because it's a new disease, there is no template for understanding. There's no template for how states should behave. So misunderstanding is more apt to happen in those cases. Inequality of impact, I've already said a little bit about this, but if measures impinge more on certain parts of the population than others, like travel restrictions, for instance, then this can also create disorder or cause protest. And you can see this during the current epidemic quite clearly in China. March 2020, you had workers from Hubei province, although the quarantine there had been lifted, trying to move into a neighboring province to go to work, but were prevented from doing so by the authorities of that state, and a riot then ensued. The same thing happened in Moscow in 1770 with the plague. Migrant workers were prevented from traveling and therefore lost their income and rose up in riots against the Tsar as a result of that. And that's the picture you can see there. Distrust of the state and its agents. Usually if there's, in a country where there is long-standing distrust of the state, and that's very evident in colonial contexts. For instance, in India, in the 1890s when plague occurred, there's a lot of disorder as a result of this. But where there's, even if the state is acting in what it perceives to be the best interests of the population, if there's long-standing distrust, it can actually create disorder. And that happened then in those colonial contexts. It's happened much more recently in, say, West Africa during the Ebola epidemics, 2013-14. And in the picture here, you can see armed police trying to enforce, and troops trying to enforce a quarantine in Monrovia, the capital of Liberia. And in Liberia and other West African countries, there's a lot of ethnic division, long-standing distrust of authorities. It was very difficult for any government to really impose order there and to try to deal with the epidemic. And one thing we've seen a lot recently, but actually goes back into the 19th century, is a kind of distrust of science too. This is another important factor. It's probably most easy to understand this from a very contemporary perspective. In the case of the present pandemic, we've seen distrust of the projections, the modeling of epidemiologists. We've seen distrust in certain countries, particularly maybe the US, but also in parts of Africa, UK, other parts of Europe, about the evidence base for protective measures, including face coverings and other forms of personal protective equipment. And as you can see in the picture here, there's also a lot of distrust about vaccines, about why vaccines are being trialed in a certain part of the world, say, in this case, Africa, or rumors relating to the contents of vaccines, and all kinds of really strange stuff which is circulating. But to get the picture, this is another important factor in the perceived legitimacy of public health measures which are taken to deal with an epidemic. And cultural insensitivity, I won't spend long on this because it's pretty self-evident. If measures are taken without consulting a particular community, say particularly a religious or ethnic community, then they can be, they're much more likely to give rise to disorder and protest. And there's countless examples of that throughout history. Okay, I just want to move on to the present pandemic and focus on that for the last few minutes. I want to see what generalizations we can make about protest in the current pandemic, and to see what are the similarities and also differences with previous epidemics and pandemics, and to see what we can actually learn from the experience so far, so we can actually maybe think about how to deal with some of the situations that may occur in the tail end of this pandemic and also future ones. And the picture you can see here is actually the kind of the results, one of the results of the riot that I mentioned a moment ago, as in China in March 2020, when the workers from Hubei protested against not being allowed to go to work in the neighboring province. As you can see there, as is often the case, and it's been very often the case in this present pandemic, the police are often the kind of the butt of protest because they're the people who are trying to enforce state measures. So one of the things that we've seen in the case of COVID-19 is a certain amount of fear about people who are spreading the disease, and protest has sometimes been turned on against those people as well as against the state. In several countries, and I think India is a good example, there's been quite a few attacks, some of them fatal, on people who've been suspected of being infected. In other words, people, say, coming into a village from outside who are perceived to be infected. And this is a kind of thing you can see throughout history. It goes back, obviously, many hundreds of years. But sometimes it can be a form of protest, this kind of scapegoating. Sometimes the people who are coming in from outside are already people who are about, maybe there is some suspicion, maybe because they have some government role, for instance. And governments are also blamed sometimes for allowing people to move around. So there is a connection between the attacks on individuals and discontent with how a government may be handling a particular situation, like an epidemic. In some cases, also, protests of this kind have allegedly been manufactured or at least backed by rival states. And one of the allegations, for instance, that was made in, I think it was about March, was that there were some attacks on people who were quarantined, or people being brought into quarantine stations in parts of the Ukraine. And people didn't, as is often the case, people didn't want people who were possibly infected to be located in their communities. But the Ukrainian government alleged that some of the protesters had been backed by Russians who were trying to destabilize the country. So this type of thing, I think, is kind of relatively new twist to something which has been going on for a very long time. A lot of the protests are linked in some way to the issue of inequality. And it's clear that COVID-19 has highlighted inequalities in terms of the fact that certain groups or classes or ethnic groups have been maybe more exposed to the disease than others by virtue of their occupations, living conditions, and so on. And also that certain people have suffered more from it than others when they actually contract the disease. And generally speaking, that's I guess people who are maybe in some ways usually kind of socially disadvantaged. But the measures themselves are also being perceived to be to have a kind of unequal impact. I think COVID has revealed a lot of intergenerational inequality, and young people have seen their education very badly affected by the measures which have been taken to deal with COVID. The opportunities to socialize and also the economic opportunities have been restricted by lockdowns. And so many young people feel that they are being discriminated against. And you can see, I've seen very clearly over the last week in the UK that it's really kind of young people that are driving most of the resistance to the anti-epidemic measures. And clearly the poor have also felt disadvantaged by things like lockdown. Many will lose their jobs, or many have lost their jobs. Many are prevented from traveling if they're migrant workers, say in India. And certain ethnic groups have also felt disadvantaged. So it's clear that COVID has really highlighted many of these inequalities, both in terms of the disease itself and also the groups which have been disproportionately adversely affected by the measures to control it. Now, if we look at the dynamics of the protest in this movement, during this pandemic, it's interesting that a lot of the protest which is occurring in some countries is essentially a kind of hybrid. The pandemic has created in many countries a great deal of tension. But at the same time, there were other protest groups, most obviously Black Lives Matter, but also some anarchist groups and right-wing groups who were protesting about different things. And a lot of the grievances that were being expressed by those groups intersected with other grievances that were related to COVID-19 or the way in which states were handling COVID-19. So what we have now is a very complex and dynamic and very volatile situation where lots of different kinds of protest and lots of different sorts of grievances are all closely bound up together. And it's very, very difficult to predict how that is going to play itself out in different countries. So it's a very, very unstable situation. The key to trying to control this, I think, is to avoid inflammatory policing, to have really good community liaison. That's absolutely crucial. Just this weekend, I was in a city called Leeds with the police dealing with some of these situations. And community liaison officers there were really made all the difference and prevented a very volatile situation from turning into a riot, I would say. Now, the forms of protest which you've seen during this pandemic have included full-scale rioting in a number of countries. There's been a fair amount of violence against state agents, police, and health workers. Health workers are often seen actually as sources of infection, and that's one of the reasons why they're attacked, not simply because maybe they're implementing unpopular measures. But both of those are important factors. There's been protest related to people's resistance to complying with social distancing, mask wearing, particularly in the US, to some extent also in the UK and other parts of Europe. Obviously, less evidently in other countries, although I'm aware that even in Japan, that's happened to a very, very limited degree. But some of the most interesting stuff has actually been a destruction of symbolic targets, which have included things like hospitals and health facilities, but also in many Western countries, and by that I will also include countries like New Zealand, destruction of 5G phone masts. And this is, here you can see one burning. This was in the UK. There was a phase, particularly in the first few months of the pandemic, to attack these masks. The reasons for doing it were very diverse. Some people believe that these masks emitted rays which made people more susceptible to COVID-19. Other people believed, particularly some anarchists and eco-extremist groups, were trying to destroy infrastructure to prevent a return to normality. Some organized criminal groups were also attacking them for other reasons unrelated to COVID. But this was a really bizarre aspect of the at least the first part of the pandemic in terms of protest. What we're seeing now in the UK in particular, I'm not sure if it's true of other countries, is a form of kind of generational protest where young people coming together in unlicensed music events. And these in the UK now are one of the major potential flashpoints where people are expressing their fatigue and frustration with lockdown measures. And lastly, of course, we've seen many, many cases of ethnic and class conflict in this pandemic. So just moving towards the end here, I think COVID-19 is different from many other pandemics or epidemics because in many epidemics, you tend to, or most epidemics, if you have protest, you tend to see it towards the beginning when the state begins to clamp down on a disease. In the case of COVID, I think the sting is in the tail, actually, of this pandemic. I think the economic consequences of the lockdown in terms of rising unemployment, possibly food price inflation, other kinds of inflation, along with fatigue and frustration with lockdown measures. Those things, I think, are going to create more disorder, actually, as the epidemic begins to tail off before at least a vaccine or vaccines are introduced. So I think there's probably a lot more trouble ahead, unfortunately. Then just move to my conclusion. So why has COVID-19 generated a lot of protests globally? I think the main reason is that it's a new disease. And here, obviously, you can see lots of historical precedent. I think uncertainty is greater, obviously, among the general population as a result of that. And governments basically, you know, they don't have a pre-existing template as to how to deal with them, although, of course, some governments have dealt with it more effectively than others, or at least appear to have done. The uncertainty has also made it very difficult for the public to evaluate the legitimacy and the efficacy of what the government is doing. So that's apt to create a certain amount of distrust in government. And thirdly, I think this pandemic's unleashed a lot of latent tensions, and some of which arise from globalization, also long-standing intergenerational tensions related to perceived inequalities. All those things have really come out as a result of this pandemic and the measures taken to control it. And of course, you can see that to some extent in the way in which the protest against the pandemic has become, in many cases, intertwined with other protests like Black Lives Matter. I think the strength and ultimately the weakness of these protests is the lack of an effective, or at least a kind of consistent leadership. They're basically ephemeral protests in the main. They're kind of inchoate expressions of anger and frustration. But I think this could change if you like, acute disorder turns into agitation relating to chronic unrest, which may occur as a result of long-term unemployment. And that's one of my biggest fears, I think. So I'll just leave it there. Thank you very much for your time.
So thank you very much, Professor Harrison, for your, the insightful, also very, the important lectures. And in your presentation, in your lecture, you emphasize that, the current COVID-19 somehow highlights the latent social, also economic and political tensions or problems. It's somehow uncover all of these things. So we need to also take care of it, not only the COVID itself, but also we need to take care of all of the social, economic, and political factors. And I'd like to ask one question for you. Especially for the current COVID-19, somehow the highlight or the now we see the tension between WHO with United States. Somehow the protest for international organization in charge of mitigate the impact of this the pandemic. How do you think? Why such kind? This is, I think, quite new. That there's a lot of factors related to this protest. But how do you think, U.S. or U.S. attitude or WHO? It's somehow the rivalry between U.S. and China. Would you share your view on that?
Yeah, this is a very, very, very complex issue, and I think that in order to understand it, obviously, you need to kind of wind back a little bit from the pandemic and to think about two things which have affected the way in which the US might have judged whatever the WHO did, regardless. First of all, is it's quite clear that for a long time, during President Trump's period of office, and indeed before, there's been a lot of suspicion in Republican circles, especially in the US, about global institutions, about globalism. And that clearly affects the perceived legitimacy of anything that a global body says and does, whether it's the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization. So that's kind of one thing. Secondly, obviously there was the tension between the US and China. And so when the WHO came into China and conducted an analysis of what was happening in China at an early stage in the pandemic, there was an inevitable, inevitable kind of sense that there was some conclusion, some collusion between China and the WHO, because America was suspicious of both China and global institutions, right? So I think clearly there was always going to be a problem with the legitimacy of what the WHO was doing in relation to China because of those two things. But having said that, I think the WHO made the situation much worse because of some of the public pronouncements of the director, and also, and I have actually read the report, the WHO report on the investigative visit to China. It's quite clear that it was very, very uncritical of China, and I think it was very, it seemed to any I think kind of scientific reader that they weren't using the usual standards of objectivity. And so I think the WHO made it a lot harder for itself. And I think its reputation suffered in a number of countries as a result of that, not just in the US. So broadly speaking, I think that these three factors are important in kind of understanding, how the WHO how the US has reacted to the WHO. I'm not saying that it's kind of right or wrong, but I think that's the kind of the dynamics of the situation.
Thank you very much. I'd like to pick up one question briefly, from the floor. So one participant asked you, the Japanese people are so obedient, under the current pandemic. Japan, as you know, Japan is still somehow, it's not under control, but still, how can I say, the infections are still spreading, among these countries, within Japan. But how do you think about that? Why Japanese looks like so obedient? Do you have any idea on that?
Well, I mean, I wish I knew more about Japanese society. You'd really need to get a good answer on that. You'd need to ask somebody who had made a kind of special study of Japanese society. But I think it's not necessarily about trusting government. I think it's also about kind of how people respect each other. So I think for a very long time, even though the government, well, in Japan, as I understand it, was not being say particularly aggressive in terms of its COVID measures, people nevertheless for a long time socially distanced and stayed at home because that was in some senses a kind of out of respect to other citizens. I get the sense that it's not just a case of obedience as such. I think it's also probably an indication of the kind of cohesiveness of Japanese society, the fact that people kind of respect each other as opposed to simply respecting the government. So I mean, that's kind of my view, and I really, you all, all of the Japanese people in this room have far more insight into this than I do. But I think it's not simply, basically what I'm trying to say is that it's not simply about obedience. There's also something about kind of mutual respect. And
okay, thank you very much. Already run out of time. So I'd like to ask all of you to thanks for Professor Harrison, even though from UK, he joined this very important event. So thank you very much, Professor Harrison.
Thank you. Pleasure.
So I'd like to end this session.